I'm going to move right on to our next speaker now, since we're on the half hour. Professor Jeffery D. Long from Elizabethtown College, a great colleague of ours here at Arihanta Institute, who we work with so closely on so many things. And the title of Professor Long's talk is Compassionate Speech, Overcoming Polarization Through Anekāntavāda. Professor Long, welcome to the stage, welcome to the conference, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Chris. Jayendra, I hope I'm audible to everyone.
You're
Uh,
wonderful.
okay, very good. I could actually just keep sitting and listening to Professor Bohanik all afternoon. I've thoroughly enjoyed the presentation that you've given, Kojin. That last point you made about maybe causing more problems if you immediately dropped everything and became a mendicant immediately made me think of the opening chapters of the Gita, Bhagavad Gita, because that's essentially what Krishna is cautioning Arjuna against. We have other obligations, and we have to think of those as well. Um, our presentations, I think, will flow together nicely because a big focus of my work, and if any of you know any of my work at all, I've written and spoken a lot on Anekāntavāda through the years, and a big interest of mine has been how Anekāntavāda translates into compassionate speech. And the idea that an important part of both navigating our way through the world nonviolently as possible with others, and also part of our own spiritual growth and evolution involves reducing those kinds of anger and those kinds of passions that arise very often when we are engaged in philosophical debate and disagreement and clashing of worldviews. And so I came up with this talk on Anekāntavāda and compassionate speech as a kind of antidote to polarization. But I want to share with you before I actually formally start my presentation that um, the world has changed since I developed my proposal for this conference. And it has made me think about this topic in a somewhat different way. I haven't changed my mind about any of the basics, but I've made an alteration to this presentation, and the focus is I start off with the personal focus, but I expanded out to more of a social focus as I go on because of things that have been happening in the world. And so I think in that sense, again, I think it's a good fit with what Professor Bohanik just presented. So I will share my screen and let's see if let's my presentation hopefully is visible. Hopefully everyone sees the beautiful Arihanta Institute logo there. And I will continue then. Compassionate speech, overcoming polarization through Anekāntavāda. And so the overview of what I initially intended to present follows. So the presentation, as I originally conceived of it, would argue for the application of Anekāntavāda to the discussion of controversial topics as a form of compassionate speech. Why is compassionate speech important? This is not simply a matter of observing civility, though it is that too, but of communicating effectively and cultivating within ourselves the kind of disposition toward others that's most conducive to advancing on the spiritual path. In the Jain tradition, an essential key to advancing toward moksha, toward liberation, is the cultivation of a state of equanimity, samayik, right, or samayika in Sanskrit, which prevents the influx of karmas into the soul, the life force or the jiva. Right? When we have equanimity into this in the soul, then the karmas are not attracted. On the other hand, when the soul is turbulent, that is, when it's subject to the kashayas, the passions, this attracts karmas into the soul. So this is a matter of maintaining that state of calm equanimity, even in the midst of conversations where we might find that we're disagreeing very deeply with our interlocutor. Much of social media today promotes mental states that are the opposite of samayika, encouraging us to feel fear and hatred for those who differ from us. This is destructive to both spiritual life and society. And in fact, the "and society" part is extremely important. That's what I really want to highlight as I move on through my presentation. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but It sometimes almost seems as if social media is designed to keep us from moksha, because it so much is calculated to, as they say, push people's buttons, get them angry, get them upset, and not think clearly or rationally or compassionately toward the person with whom they're engaging. So this is destructive, like I say here, to spiritual life and society. Now I'm going to come back to what has happened to society, I think, as a result of this. I used to write about this in a somewhat speculative fashion. It seems to me that the future has arrived. So I want to talk about that in that sense. So, some further background: an essential element of compassion, which can be defined as a practice of empathy rooted in the insight that all beings are deeply interconnected, is an awareness of the central role that the beliefs and worldviews of people play in their sense of self. Even if we find that we disagree strongly with some or even many of the views held by another person, if we wish to engage with that person compassionately, it's vital that we understand why that person believes as they do. It's equal crucial to our own growth as beings on the spiritual path that we remain open to the truths perceived by others, even when those truths appear to conflict with the truths that we perceive ourselves. We each have an incomplete picture, right? We are, unless a Jinnah has tuned into this Zoom, um, we are not omniscient beings. We each have a partial perspective that needs the complementarity that arises when we engage with others. So the Jain teaching of the Anekāntavāda, that is the multifaceted nature of reality, encourages us to practice speech that is compassionate, enabling us to engage with the worldviews of others not as rivals to our own or as false views in need of refutation, but as potential elements in a wider truth of which we ourselves are only partially aware. For all beings who've not attained omniscience, and I've underlined this, I'm going to return to this point. The proper attitude when engaging with the views of others is humility and openness to learning new things, as well as a willingness to share our own insights when these are welcome. Anekāntavāda can thus serve as an antidote to the violent and uncompassionate polarization that currently afflicts much human discourse. It can open the door to more compassionate and insightful speech and a deeper dialogue across worldviews. In case anyone is unfamiliar with this idea that I'm describing, I am assuming most are pretty familiar with this if you're interested in Jain studies. But Anekāntavāda is the doctrine of the non-one-sided, that is, eka anta, not one-sided, not one-ended nature of existence. Or phrased positively, it affirms the inherent complexity of the cosmos. The cosmos is like the gem depicted in the picture here. It has multiple facets. This is therefore the opposite of reductionism, Anekāntavāda, which seeks to explain all phenomena in terms of one single phenomenon. According to Anekāntavāda, we could also call this absolutism. There is one true viewpoint and one truth about reality, but according to Jain teaching, in fact, reality is multifaceted. As Dr. Bohanik mentioned, it's an ontological pluralism. For every facet or aspect of reality that exists, there is a perspective from which a given entity, a given reality can be viewed. And Naya, this is Nayavada, the Jain doctrine of perspectives. And Anekāntavāda, the complexity of existence, Nayavad, the multiplicity of perspectives, have implications for how we should make claims about the nature of reality, how we should state our views. And any given claim about an entity, according to Syadvada, which is really kind of the application of Anekāntavāda and Nayavada, according to this teaching, from one perspective, a claim may be true, but from another perspective, it may be false. It can also be said to be both true and false if we take both these points of view into account. It may be beyond description. I had a wonderful conversation with Acharya Sri Sagaji a couple months ago in India. He described this fourth truth value as silence, the sense in which we really just cannot put a truth into words. Or it may be a combination of any of the above statements, and there are three possible combinations of those, making for the sevenfold perspective, Saptabhanginaya, also called Syadvada, which I was very pleased when Acharya Sagaji translated this as relativity, because I've been calling it that for years, and people give me a hard time for it, but I have the validation of a respected Jain Acharya in calling it relativity. Um, An example I like to use with students of what all this means, right? A concrete example is this series of photos of the Crab Nebula. Some of you have seen this before in presentations that I've given. The Crab Nebula as photographed through various wavelengths of light, and you can see it looks quite different in each one. And some of them bear somewhat of a similarity to the others. Visible light and ultraviolet, infrared, you could tell there's kind of a discernible shape there that's common across those wavelengths. But then look at gamma rays or X-rays, right? It looks very, very different. But these are all views of the same object. So none of these is the one true Crab Nebula. The true Crab Nebula would be a combination of all of these plus more, right? Plus more that we can't even necessarily perceive. So in the same way, reality is multifaceted. It can be viewed validly from many perspectives, and these perspectives need not be identical. So the metaphysic of Anekāntavāda is a realist one. The 8th century CE Jain philosopher Haribhadrasuri affirmed this very strongly in his writings. Anu Mundra, hopefully you're watching, wrote a fantastic dissertation about this for University of Chicago. The basic principle is that we all inhabit the same reality, right? This is the non-reductionist view that every aspect of our experience is in some way rooted in a shared reality. It's not to be dismissed as illusory or false. At the same time, each aspect of our experience is limited, as is knowledge based on a point of view rooted in that particular aspect, right? When anything short of the omniscient knowledge of the jinnah is limited. So to know reality, we need to learn from others. We need to listen. We need to be open to the truth that others have to say. This is the opposite of the kind of really nasty polarization that we see so often in our world today. Now, I've modified my presentation a bit because of some historical realities that have occurred in the last few months. And the foundation on which these events were built, I think, is the foundation of the polarization and its effects. And the destructive effect on society of polarization, of course, there are many, distrust of others, distrust of our neighbors, and so on. But I'm very concerned with an epistemic issue, which is the disintegration of a shared view of reality. A shared view of reality, again, is foundational to Anekāntavāda, right? We are looking at different aspects of one reality, according to Jain teaching. And in fact, most Indian systems of philosophy teach this. There is an objective reality, right? Even systems which argue that all is consciousness, it's not just a subjective projection of consciousness. It's a universal consciousness in which we're all participating. So what's happened because of polarization is people don't even agree on basic facts any longer, right? Polarization has led to a situation in which large numbers of human beings are living in epistemic bubbles. We're not communicating with each other. The polarization has become so intense that we don't even really hear one another. We're talking within our respective bubbles. Again, if the reality is that we're all interconnected, we're working very much against that by doing this. Basic facts are often disputed, thus undermining the premise of ontological realism on which Anekāntavāda is based. Or to quote a frequently cited phrase, you're entitled to your own perspective, but not to your own facts. Reality is reality. It is what it is. This has facilitated the rise of authoritarianism, in which one perspective alone is promoted with the power of the state at the expense of all others. This is a massive problem for society. We have all the bubbles, but the bubbles are not all equal. And when people who hold one particular perspective and reject all others actually gain access to power, they have the ability to do violence, not just epistemic violence, but physical violence to those with whom they disagree, to make their bubble coextensive with reality, essentially, by eliminating all the other bubbles. And so you get a very aggressive promotion of just one perspective, one point of view, and the polarization has become so deep that there's no question of trying to actually engage in a dialogue or try to change that perspective in any way or engage that perspective in some other kind of a way of thinking. So this is a classic example of Anekāntavāda, that is absolutism or one-sidedness. In contrast, And this is a new idea. Maybe others have thought of it, but it's new for me. I want to argue that Anekāntavāda is it fits very well with the ideal of democracy. In contrast with absolutism, which lends itself to authoritarianism, the promotion of a single point of view, Anekāntavāda can be conceived as a philosophy that's conducive to democracy, right? It sits well with democracy because many points of view are invited to be part of the public conversation. If you look at the founding figures of the United States, people like Thomas Jefferson, for example, they had the idea that if you get everybody together in the public square and smart people get together with a shared set of facts but maybe wildly differing perspectives, they talk about things, the truth eventually arises, right? The various facets of truth, the various partial perspectives supplement one another, and we get a wider view and we get a better view. And I've been reading a lot of political science lately, and there's actually an empirical argument that systems so constituted, as messy and complicated and troublesome as they can sometimes seem, have far better results in the long run than authoritarian systems where you're dependent on just one point of view that doesn't allow for certain realities, certain facts to arise. I'm reminded of a line in the film Oppenheimer, um, in which there's, of course, the race is on between the US and Nazi Germany to build the atomic bomb. And the American scientists and the European scientists who are helping the Americans, they say, well, we have some good news. Hitler just denounced quantum theory as Jewish science. And so they're all very pleased because, okay, well, they're not going to make much progress then in their atomic program. Thank goodness, of course, in the long run, that Hitler did not prevail. But that's an example of how, with an authoritarian perspective, basically you just have one person's view determining everything. And because all of our views individually are limited, then the outcome is not going to be as strong as when you get many perspectives and many thoughts and many ways of thinking engaging with one another. And in fact, I think you could make an argument that in ancient and classical India, where Jain thought arose and thrived, that this was understood, that although uh, pre-modern Indian governmental systems were largely monarchical, they were not always absolutist. In fact, there was quite a lot there was a consultative dimension to Indian government throughout most of history because you have at each level you have councils of wise people, right? At the village level, you have the panchayat, you have the acharyas, the leaders of all of the various sampradayas, the different religious systems. You have multiple centers of authority, and the monarch always had to, even if the monarch's word was final and was law, the monarch knew that if he did not engage with all of these other perspectives, that uh, the outcome was not going to be good. And so this fits very well. I mean, I can see Anekāntavāda sort of translating into a model of society where everyone has their perspective and everyone contributes that perspective to the conversation about the collective good. Gandhi, of course, was deeply influenced by Anekāntavāda. He saw it as a pragmatic doctrine, a way of viewing others with empathy. He once said, I used to resent the ignorance of my opponents. Today I can love them because I'm gifted with the eye to see myself as others see me, and vice versa. I want to take the whole world in the embrace of my love. His willingness to accept many points of view, his acceptance of relativity, however, by no stretch of the imagination could you say that this was a relativity that in some way compromised his deeper principles. It emanated from those principles. He was profoundly committed to building a world based on compassion and to resisting evil. And so this is what we have to understand. So I want to conclude my remarks. I think I've reached my time limit. I just want to say that what I have sort of added in my presentation today to what I've often spoken about in Arihanta Institute and in other contexts, that this is not only a matter of listening and respecting the views of others, it is also a matter of sustaining the conditions that allow that kind of conversation to occur. And authoritarianism is the end of conversation because it's just the perspective of one person. And if that person is non-omniscient, then we've had it. So I will conclude on that note. And I think maybe there's a little time for questions or other thoughts. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Long. You've presented for us on Anekāntavāda in various ways at various times, and there's always something new that emerges out of your presentations, and I really appreciate you once again sharing this knowledge with us, and this kind of switch now to seeing how authoritarianism is a kind of defiance of the spirit of this very thing. I do see one question already in the chat. I have several as well. This is from Ayan, who's one of our incoming graduate students in the Engaged Jain Studies program. And he asks, is Anekāntavāda similar to the concept of neti neti? And I think that's a good question for you, being the comparative theologian that you sometimes are.
It's a wonderful question. I would say one dimension at least of Anekāntavāda is comparable to neti neti. That is, or when we look at Syadvada, when we look at the implication of Anekāntavāda for speech, the fourth of the seven possible truth values that the Jain tradition gives to truth claims is that inexpressible or silent dimension, where the true nature of an entity cannot be encompassed finally in words. And we see this also, one of my favorite Jain thinkers, Kunda Kundacharya from the Digambara tradition, who talks about the Nishchanaya, that is the absolute perspective, which also cannot be captured in words. It is the experience of the jiva when it is completely free from all karmic defilements, right? When it is completely liberated, it cannot be expressed in words. And we see this played out in the Digambara tradition in how it conceives of, for example, Mahavir's post-enlightenment career. According to Digambara tradition, Mahavir did not teach in words. He emitted a sound. This is called the Divyadvani. This was a spontaneous sound that his body emitted. And the Ganadharas, that his disciples, who were very near omniscience, but they were not themselves omniscient beings, but they had the ability to discern meaning from that sound, and they then write the Jain scriptures and lay out the Jain worldview based on it. But even the Jain worldview, according to Kunda Kunda's teaching, is an attempt to put it into words, right? That finally only the experience itself is adequate. And so this is very much like the idea of neti neti in the Upanishads, that one who has experiences Brahman experiences something that is really utterly beyond the capacity of words to express. We see this also in the Buddhist tradition. I was just this past week, I was teaching some Zen readings to students in a class, so this is very fresh in my mind. But the satori, right, the moment of insight that occurs in the Zen tradition can't be put into words. And then you have all these beautiful, almost absurd sounding koan. These are very poetic expressions of enlightenment that make people go, what? It's pointing to the fact that it cannot finally be captured in words. And yes, the ultimate complexity of existence is such that only an omniscient being can perceive all of the infinite facets that make up any given being. So yeah, there are resonances with neti neti.
Wonderful. Answered like a true comparative theologian in a sense there. Thank you, Professor Long. There is also a thank you for you here and another question. Eileen Harrington says, thank you. Thanks, Professor Long. Very uplifting and clear. It's what is often talked about in nonviolence practices with others when we're in relationship with them, like nonviolent communication, I think they're pointing to. So that's a great observation. Thank you, Eileen. And we do have a question from Dinesh Jain. We have about 5 minutes left, and I can put this in for you here, Professor Long. Jajinder, Professor Long, could you also elaborate on Syadvada, the corollary of Anekāntavāda, please, so the explanation will become more clear. Thank you.
Okay, very good, very good. Yes, so the idea is we are each perceiving a complex reality, right? That's the Anekanta part. The facet we are perceiving from a certain perspective. That's the Naya part. So then when we verbalize that truth, when we engage in predication, right? When we talk about the nature of an entity, we are always doing so, to quote Obi-Wan Kenobi, from a certain point of view, right? We're looking at it from that limited perspective. Now, because knowledge is relational, according to the Jain tradition. It is the relationship of the jiva to the world. And so we are perceiving something true and real whenever we're perceiving. So even if what we're perceiving is say an optical illusion, but we're seeing something, right? We're seeing something is there. In some sense, whatever we say about that thing from that point of view is going to be true. There's another sense in which it's going to be false because we're seeing it incompletely. We're only seeing it from our point of view. We're excluding other points of view. And if we combine both of those, we could say, well, in some sense it's true, in some sense it's false. It's both true and false. And then there's that neti sense that we were just talking about, in which nothing you can say can fully reproduce that entity, right? We don't have that power. We don't have the. I was reading a science fiction story about beings who had the ability, when they were speaking, to actually create a complete idea in the other person's mind of exactly what they were seeing. We don't have that, at most of us at our current level of evolution. So there is that about which we must simply be silent. And then you have the three non-redundant combinations of those. That is, it's in one sense true and indescribable, in one sense false and indescribable, in one sense true and false and indescribable. And if you try to keep adding them, then they become redundant. So the Jain philosophers concluded that there are 7 degrees of truth of any given claim. So that's the brief explanation of Syadvada. Syad means in a certain sense or from a certain point of view.
Right. Yes. Thank you so much. I think we do have about 2 minutes left for this question. If you want to try to answer this question, Professor Long, another comparative question from Shivani Botra, our colleague at Cal State Long Beach,
Ah,
who's here with us, who says, given the historical and philosophical overlaps between Jainism and Buddhism, how might we explore potential intersections between Anekāntavāda and Buddhist approaches to plurality, perspective, or epistemology?
oh, that's a wonderful question. And it immediately makes me think of Bhima Krishna Motilal's wonderful little book, Anekāntavāda, The Central Philosophy of Jainism. He has a chapter in there where he compares and contrasts Anekāntavāda and Syadvada with Shunyata and the teaching of Nagarjuna, so in the Madhyamika interpretation of Mahayana Buddhism. Um, and according to Motilal, he says these two are doing something very similar, but in another sense completely opposite. That is, the Nagarjuna's understanding of the middle path is it is the silence between the various points of view. The various points of view are all imperfect attempts to grasp at some aspect of reality, and we err if we grasp at one or the other. So therefore, we say no to all of them. The approach we see in the Jain tradition is to give a kind of qualified yes to all of the perspectives. This is kind of right, but this is also kind of right. None of them is completely right. And so, and I think this is in keeping with the very deep commitment to ahimsa, right? That no perspective is completely disregarded as utterly not worthy of consideration. The Buddhist tradition is more worried, I think, about the psychological effects of attachment to views, and so that's what it's doing. But in a sense, you could say that to hold a view as only relatively true is also a kind of detachment. It's like you kind of treat it as a working theory more than as this is my absolute truth. And I think that's where I can see the two converging. Jay Garfield, who's written a lot on Nagarjuna, sort of talks this way about Nagarjuna. It's not that you can't hold views. You know, if someone asks you a question about something on the practical level, you need to answer it. But that answer is provisional and is qualified by all kinds of other conditions, you know, time, space, causation, and so on. And in that respect, I think Buddhism and Jain thought are quite close in this regard.
Wonderful. We are coming up on time for the next talk, but I really want to thank you so much, Professor Long, for once again engaging with us so meaningfully. Your mind is like a Jain doxography, able to access the truths of all these traditions on the spot. And I'm always so impressed by your ability to answer these questions as profoundly as you do.